Good morning and welcome to Our Issues Milwaukee. I'm your host, Andrea Williams. Our focus this morning is on gun violence and the gun debate in America. Gun violence in the U.S. results in tens of thousands of deaths and injuries every year. In the wake of yet another school shooting, this time killing 17 people at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in South Florida, the debate has been reignited. In my opinion, it's necessary to have a conversation on where we go from here in our country, as well as right here in Milwaukee. My first guest is David Muhammad. He is the program manager for the Office of Violence Prevention here in the city. They provide strategic direction and oversight for city efforts to reduce the risk of violence through partnerships with government, nonprofit organizations, neighborhoods, and faith organizations. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here. And the Office of Violence Prevention actually operates under the Milwaukee Health Department.
That's
so
correct.
If you would explain why the issue of violence is actually approached from a health perspective.
Well, if we looked at violence and the amount of lives that are taken and how it takes place in our society, if it was, say for example, a communicable disease, we would be looking at ways to prevent it on the front end. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, because we've looked at violence historically from a punitive end, we've only looked at enforcement and incarceration as a way to address the problem. But when we see violence in our communities, young people's exposure to violence at an early age is a predictor of them using violence as a social norm to resolve conflict, to address problems in the community, exposure to domestic violence, the stress levels associated in neighborhoods where there's a large amount of violence due to concentrated poverty or the availability of weapons, unemployment. Those stress levels become things that impact childbirth death at an early age when we look at cortisol levels and stress levels. So there's a large amount of trauma. If we were talking about soldiers in the theater of war, we would be addressing it from the lens of PTSD. Mm-hmm. But the PTSD we're talking about is not post-traumatic, it's present, it's persistent traumatic stress that young people in their communities face on a consistent basis. It has impacts on health, it has impacts on education, on brain development. And so all of the initiatives and efforts that we can do on the front end to alleviate this are things that we should do. Unfortunately, it's not what we have historically done. It's the only thing we haven't tried yet.
Wow, so that you paint a great picture in really getting one to understand how it all correlates with the notion of health, because trauma is something that we're hearing more and more about. So thank you for sharing that. What are some of the ways that the office is addressing violence? So I know you guys are really interested in approaching it before it even gets started. So talk about some of those ways.
Well, let me identify a couple of initiatives that we have. Mm-hmm. Currently, we partner with Milwaukee County and the Behavioral Health Division with an initiative called the Trauma Response Initiative, where we have clinicians who are embedded in Districts 5 and 7 of the Milwaukee Police Department. When a young person is a witness or a victim of violence, those clinicians get a referral. They contact and follow up with the family and connect that young person for services to alleviate the things that I mentioned when I gave the public health overview. Currently, we're expanding that to train the fire department to help identify and do those referrals as well. And the ultimate goal is to have both law enforcement and the first responders trained in how to identify trauma so that we can connect young people and families to those supports. So we really are trying to build a trauma-informed community. Additionally, we work with partners like Sojourner Family Peace Center for the Safe Exchange program for families and children who have been in homes where there's been domestic violence. We also partner with neighborhood-based initiatives to alleviate violence. And when we talk about who the best partners are, it really is at the grassroots, community, and resident level. So for example, in 2017, we helped sponsor 14 community healing events over the course of the summer. And what we saw was, in those block parties, in those book bag giveaways, the effort it took to organize and promote those events in the community actually helped not only reduce violence on the day of the event, and oftentimes nothing happened in terms of aggravated assaults or shootings those days, but it actually lessened violence, in some instances 50% in the week that followed. So we see this as a complement to enforcement while at the same time as a major public education method to help teach people that violence does not have to be the way we solve our problems.
Wow, that's amazing, and really some great statistics that I'm sure you are proud to share.
Absolutely.
November of last year, city officials and public health partners, you guys launched Milwaukee's Blueprint for Peace.
Sure.
So here we are, fast forward 4 months, you've got that blueprint. It's a pretty thick book there, so
we have,
where are we
sure.
in following, getting on pace with this blueprint?
Sure, absolutely. Well, when we talk about the blueprint, and we were joking earlier about JC's blueprint.
Yes.
The blueprint is the schematic of the building, what we want to build, and how we contract the people who actually work on this. So when we think about this, when we talk about the Blueprint for Peace, we're talking about what we want a healthy community to look like. There's 6 goals of the blueprint, and they shouldn't come as a surprise, but number 1 is stop the shooting. Number 2 is promote restorative justice. Number 3 is support youth and families. Number 4 is promote economic opportunity. Number 5 is strengthen and promote healthy and safe neighborhoods. And number 6 is coordination of violence prevention efforts. When we speak before people in the community, we tell them, and I can say this from personal experience, it's easier to intervene in a conflict where weapons have been drawn and stop a shooting oftentimes than it is to get people who are paid, who are resourced, who receive grant dollars to stop violence to work together. So the coordination aspect is really the work of the blueprint. And so we have many community partners who have been doing this work. This elevates and gives academic evidence for the support for prevention. So when we say that prevention works, a homicide, for example, costs society somewhere around $17 million. But prevention efforts cost society about $1 million. And so when we look at the benefit of investment in the front end, it actually is something that benefits not just those who live in the communities affected by violence, but the city and the counties as a whole. So we're working, we're organizing in neighborhoods, we're working with partners, we're gearing up for the summer. And it's a misunderstanding. People think when the weather gets hot, that it gets more violent.
That's what you hear people say all the time. Yeah, you do.
What we saw was last year that August and October were the 2 most violent months. And so we're using data that is provided by partners, by the Milwaukee Police Department, by different agencies to help really strategize on those places, on those individuals, and on those times of day where we can really best reach the community and prevent violence on the front end. So we're really talking about changing the way people think about each other, as well as the way organizations work together to prevent violence.
Wow, and you can hold that book up just so, Blueprint for Peace, 414 Life. I like that.
And let me just tell the audience too, 414life.com.
Okay.
They can go and read the document. There is an executive summary for those who don't have the time to go through all this, but for those who represent a community organization, we're asking people to look at this document, identify the strategies that they themselves are major participants in, and use it to tell their stories, because ultimately the community is the blueprint.
All right, so we're gonna focus our attention on guns, because in the wake of what we see happen in our city on a daily basis, the mass shootings like the one in Las Vegas, you had Sandy Hook, Columbine, most recently South Florida, it's getting to the point where it's becoming something we're getting used to. And I'm really proud of the young people in Parkland, Florida, where they are really taking a different approach this time around, as to say no more. And so I think it has forced us to have this conversation to really say that something has to be done, and it has to be done now. So in your opinion, if you would, share your thoughts on what needs to be done when it comes to guns in our society. Absolutely.
Well, I think it is wise for the older generations to really follow the lead of youth. In Milwaukee, we partner with West Cares Youth Action Council to do a peer education campaign on responsible gun ownership, because of the amount of young people who are killed accidentally, or oftentimes with self-inflicted wounds because of suicide, or using them on their peers. So part of that is education for those who are gun owners. We know that concealed carry means that there's a whole lot of weapons out there. A lot of times when we talk about the issue, we're talking about assault rifles, but handguns do an enormous amount of damage, more so than the assault rifles. And so the sad fact is that it's easier to get a weapon in a lot of our neighborhoods than it is to get a job. And so young people standing up for this issue is exactly what a problem like this needs. And you know, oftentimes we look at the state of the world and we worry about our youth, but really our youth are born with the power to change the world and resolve the problems and have the solutions for the things we need to change.
Yeah, and I said those students in South Florida, but really what they did was really set a fire underneath students all across the country, across the globe really, and we've got some young people who are going to join us next segment who are right here in our city who are working on this very issue. So I'm looking forward to talking to them. But in the meantime, according to Milwaukee police, 118 people were shot and killed in Milwaukee last year. Sadly, 9 of them were under the age of 17. It's when we hear those type of stories where innocent babies are, their lives are taken, that people really get frustrated and say something has to happen. But really, anytime someone is injured or killed by gun violence, it's heartbreaking. So something has to be done, and I think that what the Office of Violence Prevention is really doing, like you said early on, you're getting a handle on really understanding what causes these things, what's the effect, and how do you ultimately prevent it. So this is my question for you. How does Milwaukee's economic and social disparities correspond when it comes to gun violence?
It plays a major role. And when we look at the statistics and the data, if I had the ability to show a map, I could show you the areas where people are not necessarily owning their community, not owning homes, where there's economic instability, housing instability, food instability, because a lot of people are hungry in the community. When those are the circumstances that we find ourselves, we also find a high density of firearm incidents, as well as where there is a lack of education and opportunity. So I think the connection is clear. We saw that in 2015 when the murder rate spiked in Milwaukee, and we actually had 145 murders that year.
Wow.
But the more staggering number is the 633 people who were shot non-fatally. And so in addition to the economic disparities, you also have a high level of trauma that exists in the community, where you have people who walk with the emotional scars and the physical scars of violence. So the two have to be parallel. As long as we don't address the economics of the community, the blueprint won't work. So we need actually a parallel track of economic investment to support the rolling out of making our neighborhoods safe and decent.
Wow. So much we could talk about. Just real quick as we wrap up, the Office of Violence Prevention, you've had several events throughout the community. Most recently, there was one this past week at Plymouth Church on Milwaukee's north side, giving residents an opportunity to talk about their thoughts, talk about what they would like to see done. Do you see a lot of positive things coming from giving residents a chance to speak and be heard?
Absolutely. I think oftentimes when people think of Milwaukee, they think of a very negative narrative. But the strength of Milwaukee is the Milwaukee that many of us know, which has engaged residents, people who are committed, compassionate, and who are willing to get up and stand up and do something about the issues. And so we see that when we hold these community forums. I also believe that what is needed is to move from a soloist over here and a choir over here to a chorus of people singing the same song, that we deserve better, that the people of Milwaukee deserve this type of investment of public dollars to really change the condition for our families in the city.
All right, great way to end this segment. Thank you so much for coming by. Appreciate your time. David Muhammad is the program manager for the Office of Violence Prevention. For more information, you can visit milwaukee.gov. And when we return to Our Issues Milwaukee, we'll continue our conversation on gun violence. March 14th and March 24th, they're two very important days, and it's when people from around the country will allow their voices to be heard, many of them students. We'll find out more about the National School Walkout and the March for Our Lives event from student organizers right here in our city. We'll meet Marvell Reed and Linnea Stanton right after this.